so I'll just start. Welcome to the Victims of Crime Act webinar. My name is Reshma Desai, a policy specialist at the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority. Today I'm going to go through the major changes to the Victims of Crime Act Victim Assistance Program. But first, our director, John Mackey, would like to say a few words.
ICJA is the state's criminal justice research and grant-making agency. And before we begin our presentation, I want to make sure everyone has an understanding of who we are and what we do and how we do what we do. When it comes to our funding, ICJA has essentially three basic parts. First, we have our Statistical Analysis Center, or our research unit. This is a piece of state government that is empowered to analyze criminal justice trends and programs for the purpose of informing policy and funding. Next, we have our State Administering Agency, or our grants unit. This is a piece of state government that is empowered, among other things, to receive federal grants, including the block grants, the Justice Assistance Grant, Violence Against Women Act Grant, and the Victims of Crime Act Grant. Finally, we have our statutorily created Independent Oversight Board. This board is really what makes ICJA special. It is designed to bring together the leaders and representatives of the state's public safety system. Their job is to exercise broad oversight of ICJA, including informing the high-level goals or priorities of our funding. Now, when it comes to our grant making brings together these three parts in what is in essence a three-part process. It begins with our research unit that identifies the issues, the trends, the gaps that we can use our funding to address. This research then goes to our board, who uses their subject matter expertise, their connection to the work, to help establish not particular programs, but funding priorities. To do this, the board can also create ad hoc committees. So for example, with Illinois' Violence Against Women Act Fund and Victims of Crime Act Fund, ICJA's board has constituted the Ad Hoc Victim Service Committee. And this is a group of practitioners and subject matter experts who've been brought together to help inform our victim service funding. And finally, when this is complete, these recommendations goes back to ICJA. They approve these funding priorities, and it goes to our grants team to make programmatic funding recommendations based upon them. Before we turn to our presentation, I want to say a few words about why this structure and process matters. In a time of limited resources, it is essential for the state's funding agencies to do everything we can to ensure that the money we spend makes targeted and demonstrable impacts on people's lives. And this is precisely what ICJA is designed to do. Through our research, through our grants unit, through our board, we use our funds to reduce victimization and improve public safety outcomes in the most effective and sustainable way possible.
Okay, thank you. The Office of Victims of Crime recently published the VOCA Victim Assistance Program Final Rule that updates the 97 program guidelines. The rule reflects changes in the OVC policy and the VOCA statute itself and includes activities, costs, and technology that were previously prohibited or not widely in use at the time the guidelines were written. The rule went into effect August 8th of this year and must be read in conjunction with the VOCA statute. All grants under this VOCA program are subject to the government-wide grant rules in 2 CFR Part 200 and the DOJ Grants Financial Guide. This webinar is intended to provide an overview of the key changes in the rule as they pertain to grantee allowable activities and costs, and to highlight some long-standing services, activities, and costs. For a complete list of allowable activities and costs, as well as grantee program and project requirements, such as volunteer, project match, confidentiality, and record-keeping requirements, please refer to the rule and statute for guidelines. Thank you to everyone who submitted your comments and questions prior to this webinar. If you have additional questions regarding the VOCA Victim Assistance Program, they can be submitted during this presentation via the comments box. We will try to address them when this webinar is posted on our website. So many things have not changed from the program guidelines. ICJA, as the designated state administrative agency of the VOCA Victim Assistance Funds, is still required to allocate at least 10% of each year's VOCA grant for each of the 3 priority categories of crime victims. Those three are sexual assault, spousal abuse, and child abuse. An additional 10% must be allocated to underserved victims of violent crime. The rule does not provide examples of underserved victims, as they may change over time, but the preamble offers several examples and includes survivors of homicide victims and DUI, elder abuse, and LGBTQ victims, among others. Additionally, the match requirement for grantees remains at 20% cash or in kind of the total cost of each project, with some exceptions for specific grantees. A waiver process is also discussed in the rule. So there have been a lot of questions about who is a victim under VOCA. The definition of crime victim remains the same as in the guidelines. A crime victim is a person who has suffered physical, sexual, financial, or emotional harm as a result of the commission of a crime. The rule also states that victims do not have to participate in the criminal justice process, and victim eligibility under this program for direct services is not dependent on the victim's immigration status. Direct services for crime victims include services listed in the VOCA statute and those that respond to the emotional, psychological, or physical needs of the crime victims, assist victims to stabilize their lives after victimization, assist victims to understand and participate in the criminal justice system, or restore a measure of security and safety to the victim. Going through some more definitions here. Spousal abuse, one of the priority categories for funding allocation, includes domestic and intimate partner violence. This definition does not require legal recognition of any particular relationship, nor does it implicate state or territorial laws concerning marriage rights, and is intended to include LGBTQ survivors of domestic and intimate partner violence. A victim of child abuse means a victim of crime where such crime involves an act or omission considered to be child abuse under the state administering agency's jurisdiction, the relevant jurisdiction, which is the Illinois law. In addition, for purposes of this program, victims of child abuse may include, but are not limited to, child victims of physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, child pornography-related offenses, neglect, commercial sexual exploitation, bullying, and/or exposure to violence. Note that adults victimized as children are not included in this child abuse priority category for allocating funds. Adults who were harmed while they were minors can still receive services, but the victim of child abuse allocation category is intended for minor victims receiving services. ICEJA is bound by this statutory language and intends to fund as broadly as possible within the confines of the law. We're now going to discuss some key changes that pertain to who else can receive services and what types of services can be funded. Incarcerated persons. Under the new rule, VOCA funds may be used to support incarcerated victims of crime. The rule removed the prohibition on perpetrator rehabilitation and counseling that exists in the guidelines. The costs permitted for direct services to incarcerated victims are the same as those permitted to any crime victim. Funding of services to incarcerated victims is not mandated by OVC, but at the discretion of ICEJA. VOCA funding is expressly limited by statute to victim services and associated activities. Any physical, sexual, financial, or emotional harm for which services are sought must result from the commission of a crime. The crime may have occurred prior to or during incarceration. VOCA funding is intended to assist victims of crime and not to the reintegration of offenders into the community. It also cannot be used for criminal defense. Finally, it's important to remember that VOCA funds cannot be diverted to operational prison purposes or support prison costs, such as prison guard salaries or administrative expenses. VOCA funds are not subject to mandated reduction or reallocation due to noncompliance with the Prison Rape Elimination Act. So now we'll talk to some changes to grantees' allowable costs. In addition to the costs that were previously allowable, changes have been made to the following. Safety planning is now expressly allowed. The rule also elaborates on safety-related property repair, window and door and lock replacement and repair, along with other repairs necessary to ensure a victim's safety are allowable. Short-term in-home care and supervision for children and adults when the offender caregiver is removed is allowed for up to 45 days. The rule also clarified that short-term nursing home, adult foster care, or group home placement for adults for whom there is no other safe short-term residence, which was allowed under the guidelines, is also limited to 45 days. Limited emergency medical and healthcare expenses are now allowed when other resources, such as the Illinois Crime Victim Compensation Program, the Victim's Health Insurance Plan, Medicaid, or other healthcare funding sources, are not reasonably expected to be available in time, usually within the 48 hours, to meet the emergency needs of the victim. This includes non-prescription and prescription medicine, prophylactic and other treatment to prevent HIV/AIDS infection or other infectious disease, durable medical equipment, and other healthcare items. Additionally, personal advocacy and emotional support is allowable. The rule now includes numerous examples of personal advocacy and emotional support services beyond identifying a victim's needs and managing practical problems created by the victimization. It includes traditional, cultural, and/or alternative therapy or healing, such as art therapy and yoga. Mental health counseling and care has been expanded and includes, but is not limited to, outpatient therapy or counseling provided by a person who meets the professional standards based on where the care is provided. This can include substance abuse treatment, so long as the treatment is directly related to the victimization. There is no express prohibition of inpatient treatment costs in the rule, but it is important to remember that VOCA Victim Assistance Program funding may not be used for most medical care. Peer support is a new allowable expense that includes, but is not limited to, activities that provide opportunities for victims to meet other victims, share experiences, and provide self-help information and emotional support. Transitional housing and relocation. Transitional housing and relocation expenses are newly allowable expenses. VOCA funds can be used for housing and shelters to the extent that such housing is necessary as a consequence of the victimization and for the well-being of the victim. Traditional housing and relocation are intended for victims who have a particular need for such housing and who cannot safely return to their previous housing due to the circumstances of their victimization, such as human trafficking, domestic violence victims, or victims with disabilities abused by caretakers. Transitional housing may include, but is not limited to, travel, rental assistance, security deposits, utilities, and other costs incidental to the relocation of such housing, as well as voluntary support services such as child care and counseling. Relocation costs include, but are not limited to, reasonable moving expenses, security deposits on housing, rental expenses, and utility startup costs. Funding these costs is optional, and both are subject to any restrictions on amount, length of time, and eligible crimes set by ICEJA. Keep in mind that the use of VOCA funds for mortgage payments is still prohibited. So now we're going to talk about forensic interviews. It's another major change. While forensic examinations are still allowed under the rule, to the extent that other funding sources, such as state appropriations, are insufficient, forensic interviews are a newly allowable victim service. Forensic interviews are allowable as long as the results of the interview will be used not only for law enforcement and prosecution purposes, but also for identification of needs such as social services, personal advocacy, case management, substance abuse, and mental health services. The interviews must be conducted in the context of a multidisciplinary investigation and diagnostic team, or in a specialized setting such as a child advocacy center. And the interview must be trained to conduct forensic interviews appropriate to the developmental age and abilities of children, or the developmental, cognitive, or physical or communication disabilities presented by adults. The next few slides deal with the legal system and services that are allowable under VOCA. The rule allows service providers to facilitate victim participation not just in the criminal justice proceedings, but in any public proceeding arising from the crime. This may include juvenile justice hearings, probation, parole, and pardon proceedings, grievance procedures, and sexual predator civil commitment proceedings. The rule also elaborates on what services and costs may facilitate a victim's participation. These include providing non-emergency transportation so the victim can attend a proceeding, and assistance with the recovery of property taken as evidence, among other activities. More in-depth and comprehensive legal assistance is now allowed if it is reasonable and its need arises as the direct result of victimization. Such services include, but are not limited to, emergency legal assistance such as filing for restraining or protective orders, and obtaining emergency custody orders and visitation rights. Those that assert victim rights in a criminal proceeding directly related to the victimization, or to protect victim safety, privacy, or other interests in such proceedings. Motions to vacate or expunge a conviction in specific circumstances where Illinois law permits, such as a legal action based on a person's being a crime victim. And civil legal services reasonably necessary as the direct result of victimization. Examples of allowable civil legal services include, noted in the preamble, include the following. I'll reference various particular victim types that may benefit from these types of assistance in order to provide context and to how the legal assistance would be used. So, for example, protective restraining orders or campus administrative protection stay-away orders for victims of stalking or sexual assault. Family, custody, housing, and dependency matters, particularly for intimate partner violence, child abuse, sexual assault, elder abuse, and human trafficking victims. Immigration assistance for human trafficking, sexual assault, and domestic violence victims. Intervention with creditors on behalf of identity theft and financial fraud victims. And intervention with law enforcement, for example, to obtain police reports. ICJA has broad discretion to limit the type and scope of legal assistance services that grantees can provide with VOCA funds. Lastly, criminal defense and tort lawsuits are not allowable under VOCA. This is a bright line rule and in line with the OVW Legal Assistance for Victims program. Now we'll talk about multidisciplinary response and costs. The program guidelines prohibited the use of funds for coordinating multidisciplinary responses to victim needs. Under the new rule, there is greater flexibility to use VOCA funds for coordination activities in multi-system, interagency, and multidisciplinary responses, which leverage community resources to provide better and more cost-effective direct services. The VOCA Victim Assistance Funds can be used to fund activities that support a coordinated and comprehensive response to crime victims' needs by direct service providers. Here are a few expenses for which funds can be used to achieve this goal. Coordination activities such as statewide coordination of victim notification systems, crisis response teams, MDTs, and coalitions to assist victims. Participation on statewide or other task forces, work groups, and committees to develop protocol interagency, and other working agreements, as well as coordination with federal agencies to provide services to victims of federal crimes. Payment of salaries and expenses of these coordinators, as well as necessary supervisory staff that facilitate the provision of direct services, and direct service staff on child-adult abuse multidisciplinary investigations and treatment teams. Contracts for professional services not available within the organization, and forensic interviews, as we explained earlier. Okay, now we're going to talk about direct services. OVC also allows victim assistance funds to be used for training volunteers to provide direct services when these direct services will be primarily done by volunteers. This has not changed from the guidelines. VOCA allows for the procuring of automated systems and technology to support the delivery of direct services. Examples include automated information referral systems, email systems that allow communication among victim service providers, automated case tracking and management systems, and computer equipment. All systems and equipment are subject to the DOJ Grants Financial Guide and government-wide grant rules related to the acquisition, use, and disposition of property purchased with federal funds. Restorative justice was allowed under the program guidelines, but is now limited to opportunities that are reasonably anticipated to have beneficial or therapeutic value to crime victims. Crime victims must request or voluntarily agree to them and be able to withdraw at any time. Key considerations for the funding of restorative justice include program costs, as well as the safety and security of the victim and the availability of appropriate support and accompaniment for and debriefing of the victim. So now we'll talk about some grantee administrative costs. There are many additional administrative costs that are allowable under VOCA that will now be briefly discussed. Grantees may use VOCA funding to cover personnel costs that are directly related to providing direct services and supporting activities such as staff and coordinator, salaries, expenses, and a prorated share of liability insurance. Training exclusively for developing the skills of direct service providers, including paid staff and volunteers who are both VOCA funded and not. This is allowed along with training materials such as manuals, books, video conferencing, and electronic training resources. Training-related travel costs for direct service staff, both VOCA funded and non-VOCA funded, include in-state, regional, and national travel, meals, lodging, and registration fees. Organizational expenses must be necessary and essential to providing direct services and other allowable victim services. They include prorated costs of rent, utilities, local travel expenses for service providers, and minor building adaptations. Minor building adaptations and modifications are allowable if they are required to meet the Department of Justice standards implementing the Americans with Disabilities Act and/or are modifications that would improve the program's ability to provide services to victims. VOCA funding may also be used for the cost of administrative time spent completing VOCA-required time and attendance sheets and programmatic documentation, reports and statistics, including victim satisfaction surveys and needs assessments, and collecting and maintaining crime victims' records. The prorated share of audit costs is also allowed. Leasing and purchasing vehicles essential to the provision of direct service requires approval from ICEJA, as does the maintenance, repair, or replacement of essential items. Essential items contribute to the maintenance of a healthy or safe environment for crime victims, such as a furnace in a shelter. Continuing on with grantee administrative costs. As before, furniture and equipment that facilitate the delivery of direct services are allowed, Some examples include cell phones, braille equipment, computers and printers, video cameras for interviews with children, and equipment and furniture for shelters, workspaces, victim waiting rooms, and children's play areas. Equipment and furniture must be prorated if they are not exclusively used for victim-related activities. Some operating costs include office supplies, equipment use fees, property insurance, printing, computer backup files and tapes and storage, design and maintenance of websites and social media, and security systems. As you can see, operating costs include a wide variety of expenses and are not limited to these stated examples. Project evaluations can include surveys and studies, but is limited to evaluations of specific projects to determine their effectiveness and subject to any restrictions set by ICEJA. Finally, to align VOCA with government-wide grant rules at 2 CFR Part 200, OVC removed the provision in the program guidelines that prohibited grantees from charging indirect costs. In terms of indirect costs, if these costs are budgeted using federal or state negotiated rates, then a letter must be submitted to ICEJA which states what the approved rate is, the effective period, and the base, or what is the indirect cost applied to. If the grantee has never had a negotiated rate, they may elect to use the de minimis rate of 10% of their modified total direct costs. More assistance is available through the DOJ Grants Financial Guide. Okay, so now some unallowable grantee costs. There's no new unallowable costs in the rule, but the rule still prohibits lobbying, including direct or indirect lobbying or advocacy activities with respect to legislation or to administrative changes to regulations or administrative policy. Research and studies on crime victim issues with the exception of project evaluations to determine the project effectiveness. Active investigation and prosecution of criminal activities. Fundraising, unless it is fee-based or similar, program income, and authorized by ICEJA. Capital expenses, such as capital improvements, property losses and expenses, real estate purchases, mortgage payments, and most construction. Compensation for victims of crime for expenses that were incurred as a result of a crime. Medical care, except for forensic exams, limited emergency medical care, and mental health therapy as stated elsewhere in the rule and statute. Salaries, benefits, fees, furniture, and equipment expenses of executive directors, board members, and other administrators, except as expressly allowed in the rule. Finally, the rule removed the prohibition on liability insurance on buildings and security guards. Both were listed in the guidelines and proposed rule as unallowable expenses, but were ultimately removed in the final rule. OVC also lifted the prohibition against funding victim assistance at conferences, but it doesn't encourage this practice. If you have any questions, you can submit them now via the comments box. We want to thank you for logging in today and watching this webinar. You can continue to send me questions directly at my email address, which is posted right there, through the end of the week. We're going to get this webinar up on our website as soon as we can, and once we have looked at all the questions, we will post the questions and answers to that as well. Before I go, I did want to clarify one thing in this last page about conferences. I said it's victim attendance at conferences, not assistance. I misspoke. It's a lot of words. So that's it. So thank you all very much.